there's a, let's call it a structural strategy that really has been probably pioneered, but definitely advanced among postmodernists in literature that I actually find extremely interesting. And you don't see it that often as it happens, but it's extremely cool when it occurs, and it touches on a lot of the general trends we see in postmodernism, like harkening back to the old, reuse, taking all previous eras and information and using it again. These are all things we're going to get into, but I want to get on this very specific technique. I think it's extraordinarily cool. And it is, the idea is you take a well-known work and basically stay true to it, but put it through an entirely new prism. And so where I originally was exposed to this technique was John Gartner's Grendel. And it's all right there in the title. If Beowulf is the story of Beowulf, and Beowulf is Grendel's opponent, and Beowulf beats Grendel, then in Grendel, it will be the story of Grendel. And Grendel's opponent will be Beowulf, and instead of being a celebratory epic about heroic victory, it will be a tragedy. Because, of course, Grendel loses, Grendel dies. Spoiler if you've never read Beowulf. And so, what a wonderful idea. Just what a fabulous, amazing conception for someone to say, I will tell the story of Beowulf, but I will tell it from Grendel's point of view. Right? Because someone said somewhere along the line, in everybody's story, they're the hero, right? And so in Grendel's story, Grendel's the hero. Although in Beowulf's story, Grendel's the villain. And so, this is just, it's so postmodern, right? I look back and I see everything that there's been in the past, and I have the awareness and the weight of all of that past, so I'm going to take something that otherwise sits and, kind of on my shoulders as part of the legacy that I have to deal with and live with, and I turn it around. I flip it, right? And I create something that's really original and new, while at the same time being perfectly aware of the past. And we'll return to this too. Awareness, a very important part of postmodernism, is that we won't have blinders on. We will be aware of everything that came before, and we will build with that awareness, even though it is hard. And this is a perfect example. And John Gardner, like God bless you, John Gardner. So again, this is not a super common thing. Let me throw out some other examples that I can think of. Some of these will be well known. Some of these will be a little less well known. These will all probably be pretty much well known. There's a book called Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. And it tells the story of Jane Eyre from the viewpoint of the woman in the attic. So again, a lot of people know Jane Eyre, very well populated book. There's this episode. Well, that person has a whole story too, right? And this is another thing you get to in postmodernism. This getting away from solipsism, recognizing that there's a plurality of voices in the world, and that all sorts of different threads twine and touch each other. We'll see this in lots of ways, in lots of different works that we'll get into in the future. But in this case, you see it by someone taking a minor character and saying, well, that minor character in this person's arc, they have their own arc, and there's this spot where they intersect. But if I looked at the other person's line instead of the character everybody knows from the very well-known major work, you'd see a very different story which would intersect someone we recognize somewhere along the line, right? This is, I think, a really interesting art technique. One that probably will be very well known by lots of people, especially since it has been turned into, I'd say, a not very good pair of movies recently, is Wicked by Gregory Maguire. So Wicked, of course, tells the story of the Wicked Witch of the West, right? The Wicked Witch of the West. And she does indeed have encounters with some other people we know, like the Wizard of Oz, like the Glenda the Good Witch. And she has a history, she has a background and a story and how she became this and how she got that way. And it includes some of her origin story, how she winds up with the broom, how she winds up with flying. All of that stuff is built in there, right? Her history with the ruby slippers, and her history with the Wicked Witch of the East, right? Her history with Glenda, like all of that is built in there, right? And there's just the tiniest amount of Dorothy, Tin Man, Scarecrow, and Lion, right? They're in there, but just the tiniest amount, because in the totality of this woman's life, and it's, again, tragic end. This book also is a tragedy. In the totality of this woman's life, the connection to those four, adventurers, pilgrims, is tiny. It's a tiny bit of the whole thing, right? And so we get to see her whole life from her childhood, and Gregory and Maguire goes and he invents, right, this whole backstory and this whole childhood leading up to really the events we see in the movie. And so, again, we take something we all know. Everybody's seen Wizard of Oz. We all know Wizard of Oz. We all understand what this character is, and we understand certain things about this character. Green skin, dressed a certain way, I'll get you my pretty, vulnerable to water, etc. And he then creates a story that leads up to that moment. And in the process finds a lot of ways to give us things that are original and surprising. But part of why it works is because we know what we're looking at, right? Wicked, we know what happens in The Wizard of Oz. Grendel, we know what happens in Beowulf. And if this were just some story about some kind of ugly monster guy in, ancient Celtic British Isles who has a run-in with a very tough human leader of these humans, and it wasn't built on Beowulf that we know, it wouldn't be anything close to the work it is as a result now. If this was just a story about some woman, kind of outcast woman with strange colored skin who can't really ever integrate and has certain powers and abilities that she kind of builds and fosters over time, and and that once in this strange kind of magic land that had been made, once again, it wouldn't be nearly the work it is, because we know it's the Wicked Witch of the West and it's Oz, and we know these characters and we know what's going to happen, because it is Grendel, and and in the milieu of the Beowulf saga, and we know what's going to happen, right? Let's briefly talk. I haven't read any of these books, alas, but there is a set of books, and the first one is called Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. And this is very similar. What happens is the author, whose name I don't remember, I'm sorry, takes Pride and Prejudice and the narrative and the scenes that we all know from Pride and Prejudice, and then adds interstitial filler information in between. So what you see, the scenes that you see from the book are accurate to what's in the book. But there's this additional material that's been added, and the additional material is they're in a zombie apocalypse. So now you've got a story of a zombie apocalypse that is Pride and Prejudice. It's the Pride and Prejudice characters, it's the setting, and it's the same story arc, it's the same plot points. But there's a zombie apocalypse woven in. Incredibly clever. What a marvelous idea. And once again, not something like if Pride and Prejudice were not a book that people knew, this book 100% would not work. What makes it work is the reinvention. What makes it work is taking the thing we know and then recasting it as an entirely new thing while remaining entirely loyal to the thing we all know. And that's what you see in all these books. That's what you get in Grendel and Wicked and the others. Now, the last example I want to point out of this, and there are probably more, and I may come back for another episode later. As soon as I'm done with this, I'll probably start thinking of additional examples, or I'll bump into additional examples. But the last one I want to talk about is Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. Absolutely marvelous book by Tom Stoppard, or not book, play by Tom Stoppard. It is a play, and that's important because Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are in a Shakespeare play. So, yeah, you could have written a book, but it's better to write a play, right? And the, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, they are these tiny characters, right? These minor characters in the original Shakespeare. They're just these kind of pawns. And they get killed, right? When he changes the note and sends them off with the wrong note and says, kill the bearer of this note, they presumably are killed off stage. We don't even see it. They're not important enough to die in front of our eyes. They are the most minor, trivial little characters. And then Stoppard says, okay, let's take Rosencrantz and Guildenstern and let's draw their story out, right? What is their story? So again, it's the same idea. These different lines, they intersect in various places, and my storyline and your storyline might bump into each other, and there's this moment where we co-occupy, but I'm going on one track and you're going on a different track, and we're going to come from different places, and ultimately we're going to diverge again. And sometimes it's very short and it's very quick. And that sort of idea you see other places, right? Where there's a skein of interconnectedness between people. And that's also interesting. That's something to talk about. What these books have in common in particular is they start with this shared vocabulary that we have. They start with this, there's a story, there's a narrative, there's a situation, there's a main character, there's a main conflict, and this other character who is an adversary or just a minor, right? In the case of Wicked or Grendel, an adversary. In the case of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, just a footnote, right? And you're going to take this person that's not really of any significance or consequence, and you're going to say, well, in their life, they're the most significant thing in the world. They're the center of their universe. And let's tell that story. So I think this is a really fabulous technique. There may be a word for it off the top of my head. I'm not thinking of what the word is, right? We could probably coin one. If you know of a word for this, put it in the comments. I'll probably do a little research after this, see if I can figure it out. Or if you want to coin a word, if you think there's a good way to explain it, put it in the comments. I'd love to see that. I'd love to talk about it. But this is just very postmodern, right? It's postmodern in its awareness of the past. It's postmodern in the way that it takes things and reinvents it. It's postmodern in that, it likes sort of advancing technique. It's postmodern in that it's, certainly creeping toward metafictional sensibilities. In all of those ways, it's very postmodern. And again, I think as a technique, we don't see it that much, but it's delightful when it occurs. If you like Beowulf, I like Beowulf. Great. The Epic of Beowulf is a great narrative, right? If you like Beowulf, and then when you read Grendel, it's delightful. The first time it's delightful. Wicked is absolutely delightful. First of all, just because it's a fabulously written book, but second of all, because it those benchmarks from the Wizard of Oz that we all know are just such these shining lights when they occur. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead, also just delightful. It's delightfully written and conceived, and Stoppard at his best. But at the same time, the fact that it is tied back to the Shakespeare is so big. So, yeah, I'm a big fan of this technique. We may return to this again. It does fit into other motifs and tropes and techniques that we'll talk about. So we will be touching this again. Again, if you've got it, if you know of a word for this, or if you can think of a good word for this, give it to me in the comments, because we'll be returning this, and maybe I'll be using the word you provide. Thank you.